And David's here. He's in Newton Moor. Good morning to you, David.
Good morning.
More women MSPs?
Definitely. Well, not so much more women MSPs, but definitely more MPs and MSPs of a higher standard. The MPs and MSPs have let us down badly over the last 40 years.
So gender not an issue? You're talking about
Gender's
quality.
Not an issue. It needs to be quality. The big problem is none of them have noticed the problems that we've got. They've all failed us, and the system's broken, and the country's broken. Right now we're 1.45 trillion in debt. When Tony Blair came in 1997, the national debt was 330 billion. By the time they left office, it was 1 trillion. We're now at 1.45 trillion. In 5 years' time, it's 2 trillion. And in probably about another 5 years after that, it will be at 3 trillion. And they're doing nothing to combat that.
So we need people who are good with figures, whether that's men or women,
Definitely.
is what you're saying. David,
Definitely.
What about your own workplace? What do you do?
It's a hotel we run.
OK, and what's the kind of gender split? Is it pretty much 50-50 or
It's
more
bang,
men than
bang
women?
50-50.
Mm-hmm. And for you, just personally, do you think that women bring something different to the workplace? And if so, what?
Well, my wife does all the kind of organising. She's better at the organising kind of side of things, so that's how it works with us. I do most of the kind of accounts and so on. I do the VAT returns.
So she's the organiser and you're the one who's working on the figures. On the VAT side, I don't like being VAT at 20%. The VAT at 20%, if we've got any MPs out there listening, it's stifling the business. I get Australians and Americans in here. Australians pay VAT at 10%. I've got some Americans that come in that pay it at 6%, 8%. If they're lucky enough to stay in free states in America, it's 0%. See, I want to talk about women in politics. You want to talk about politics, David.
That's the thing. They need to start listening, because right now, as I say, over the last 40 years, they haven't listened, and all politicians have failed. There hasn't been a good one in the last 40 years. They've all failed.
Thank you for your call, David. Thank you very much for calling in from Newton Moor. Tricia Marwick. Now, I was asking our listeners to talk about, or to tell me about their experience of women in the workplace, you know, what the gender split is and so on. And so often we hear about women not being drawn to politics because of the hours, because just of the general environment. Do you think that women are interested in politics but are put off? Or do you think it's just not an attractive prospect as it stands?
I think women are attracted to politics, and I think you need to look at what's happening in the independence referendum at the moment. There are many women, young women, there are many women who are actually getting involved, and I think that's one of the great hopes that all of us have for the future, that, you know, women who suddenly see that politics are relevant to them are getting involved. And I think the challenge for all of the political parties is how we manage to keep and feed that through into the Scottish Parliament. I don't think that particularly ours put people off in the Scottish Parliament. One of your other callers referenced that. The Scottish Parliament has been set up to be much more family friendly than Westminster. We know when the business is in advance. We usually have decision time at 5 o'clock in the evening. We also have a creche facility. So I think the Scottish Parliament came from a completely different premise from Westminster in the first place. That may be why we have got 35% representation compared to 22% at Westminster. That's not to say that I'm complacent, because I'm not. We do need to do more. We do need to try to get women into politics at a lower level so that they can feed through, the whole system. And I think that's where our huge challenge is, to make sure that women who do become engaged in politics are retained in politics, because they are the next generation of MSPs.
Mike Buchanan, we know that we have evidence to support the theory that women bring different skills, if you like, particularly when it comes to negotiations, when it comes to leadership qualities and so on. Would you not concede that there are some jobs where women are naturally stronger than men?
I'm not so sure. If we take the issue somebody touched on earlier about women on corporate boards, I also run the Campaign for Merit in Business, And the government is bullying major companies into driving more women onto their boards. Now, I've given evidence to House of Commons and House of Lords inquiries and presented the evidence that when you artificially increase the proportion of women on boards, whether through quotas or the threat of quotas, financial performance declines. Now, not one MP or peer on those committees challenged that evidence. Not one of them presented any evidence to say there's a positive effect on corporate performance of increasing women on boards, but that's the policy direction. When it comes to advantaging women, the state is like a train which only goes in one direction. And it's something I talked about at some length at a conference, at the world's first conference, the world's first international conference on men's issues, which was held in Detroit a couple of weeks ago.
And
the idea that there's some sort of mystical female factor which improves decision making, there is just no real world evidence for that. It's a feminist fantasy.
But if we're going to have equal representation to reflect society, where in fact we outnumber men by 1% or something, surely it's reasonable to say that we have some sort of reflection of this right across the board, whether it's in politics or in work.
Well, yes, but that completely removes the issues of merit and hard work. Are you saying that if 1 in 1,000 people who are applying to be MPs or MSPs are women, that we should still have 50% women in those roles? I mean, it's just, all this talk of equality and representation, it always amounts to the same damn thing, Cathy. It amounts to special treatment for women. So basically the bar is lowered so that, you really... it's a bit like an all-women shortlist, which the Labour Party have, and which we believe the Conservatives will introduce before long. Now, one obvious consequence of all-women shortlists is that the least qualified woman in the country automatically becomes more eligible for political office than the best qualified man. Now, imagine if all-women shortlists had existed when Winston Churchill first had the ambition to become an MP. You and I would be speaking German today as a result, and life's difficult enough as it is.
So your issues with positive discrimination, that once you start asking for more women, what you're doing is employing them or enlisting them purely on gender alone and not on merit.
I mean, positive discrimination for women is negative discrimination against men. And as I say, we already have 20 areas in which men are disadvantaged by the state's actions and inactions. I'll give you one example, in the field of engineering. For decade after decade, millions of pounds have been spent trying to encourage women into engineering, and they just don't want to do it, or not in not in significant numbers. Now, at Brunel University in the next academic year, 40 female MSc students will get sponsorships worth £23,000 each on the basis of gender alone. This is sheer madness. It's known that fewer female graduates in engineering than male graduates go into engineering careers.
But that could also might be due to our education system and the perceived notion of what an engineer is. That's a question I'd like to put out there, and that is, do you think that part of that comes via education, how we see women and their role in society? Please call me on 0500 92 95 00. Do we need more women MSPs? Do we need more women in positions of authority right across the board? Do you have a woman boss, or do you have a male boss? And if so, which would you prefer? What are the dynamics in your office or indeed in your working environment? Ian Dunt is editor of politics.co.uk. He's with us. Good morning to you, Ian. Hello, good morning to you, Ian.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Have you been hearing the conversation, Mike Buchanan?
I have indeed, yes. With some interest.
And Tricia Marwick, who, of course, presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament. What's your view?
Typically, I find when positive discrimination is used, and it doesn't just have to be for women, you see the same thing, for instance, with the Met Police and ethnic minorities. It's usually as a quite cheap, public relations-friendly gimmick to stop them really having to spend the money and the effort to change the structural obstacles to people succeeding in whatever sector it is that you're talking about. So positive discrimination acts like a sort of bandage on a cancer patient. You can sort of say, oh, look, well, we're getting more women in, but you haven't done anything about the obstacles that stop them. So, for instance, making sure that you would have childcare facilities, or even, on a grander scale, that you could share childcare, the need to take care of children, or parental leave between both parents. These are much more effective ways of going about it than actually just going down the positive discrimination route, which does then have some quite negative repercussions, not least of which is not getting the best people in.
Stay with us, Ian, because I want to speak to Bob, who's called in, and I'm appealing to the sisters to call in this morning. We don't have Bob on the line there. So, Ian, would you think, as if there was equality in terms of parental leave, that might balance things a bit better?
There are numerous ways to deal with the cultural and the structural problems in whatever workplace that you're in, which means that you get roughly the same proportion of people applying and getting jobs as you would have in the normal population. After all, we know women are not less smart. We know they're not less capable. So the fact that they're not represented properly in politics isn't women's fault.
So do you think, Ian, we're just packaging it up wrong by just mentioning gender?
No, not at all. I mean, we certainly, it's a sign that something is wrong when you don't have roughly the same proportion of people working in your business or in your sector as there is in the general population. It might not be a problem with your business. As you were talking earlier about engineering, and you made the perfectly sensible point that probably that points towards schooling. It's certainly not something to do, as some people like to pretend, with some sort of biological function of the female brain, that it somehow couldn't get this subject. It's not that. It's plainly a cultural phenomenon that comes from school and works upwards. But what it is it's a sign that there's a problem. Just fixing it by creating positive discrimination, by suddenly having equal proportions, doesn't actually address the problem. It just puts a bandage on it.
But of course, some people will feel that their gender has come between them and a promotion, if you like, or an advancement at work. Morag's on the line from Dundee. Good morning to you, Morag.
Good morning, Cathy. I'm answering your appeal.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm so glad you did. I'm very disappointed. I was rather concerned because I'm not sure if this is an issue or not. But with an underrepresentation of women across the board, what do you think we could do about it? Is it politics' fault? Is it not appealing enough?
No, it's not politics' fault. It's the men's fault. Most male MPs and MSPs have wives who virtually run their constituency whilst they're away off at either Holyrood or London. And women on the whole don't have husbands or partners who are that supportive of their political careers, and I speak from bitter personal experience. And yes, of course we do. And taking up the point of engineering, has the person who said that female graduates don't go into engineering can have no perception of what it's like for a female to go into an engineering workshop, onto the work floor, etc., and be subjected to the filth and sexual abuse that women get when they go into particularly an industrial male-dominated environment. And I mean, I've said all this many times on this programme, and I'm only doing it again because women haven't phoned in and somebody needs to. Can I make also a very, very salient point at the moment? Perhaps if we'd had a heck of a lot of women in Parliament in Westminster, we wouldn't now be looking at possible paedophile rings in Westminster. I think that women need to be more represented everywhere.
Thank you for calling in, Morag. I am still appealing to our women listeners to call in with your views, more women in the workplace. Men are very welcome to phone in too, and I'm seeing a couple of calls coming through. I hope we can connect to you. John is with us, and he's on a mobile phone, which I hope to goodness stays with us before the end of the show. Good morning to you, John.
Hi there.
Good morning to you.
Good morning.
What's your work environment like?
I work as a staff nurse. I work in public health with health visitors, and my role is to visit obviously children and families at home. And within my post, I'm the only male staff nurse in the whole of the organisation. Now,
do you see that as a disadvantage?
Well, my experience has been quite positive. There's the usual banter and things that you get, but you just have to roll with the punches and see it as something that's not, personal or anything like that. But yeah, my job's been quite positive, where I think women have experienced negativity themselves. They're quite warming to somebody that's came from in a similar position as they've experienced.
And do you think it makes a good difference, if your boss senior to you is female, or not at all? I mean, how does it alter or affect the dynamics at work?
Well, I've got a female boss. I've had male bosses in the past. I think in general terms, from past experience, it's good to have a 50-50 workforce where there's quite good balance. But having a female boss has never been a problem for me. There has been issues in the past where you almost get babied a little bit, where the boss might say, well, I'm a mum myself, I'm just reminding you you've got a doctor's appointment. You're like, well, I'm 30-odd years of age, I don't really need that, but thanks very much. Anyway, so you do get... it has been a positive experience having a female boss who's very well educated and very, very clever, very, very experienced, and I've learned a lot from a female boss. And I personally have never had any issues working in a female-dominated workforce or working under a female boss either. So I can say that my experience as a man with a family and everything has always been quite a good positive experience. I've never had any negativity, really.
And in terms of politics, John, would gender be an issue for you when it came to voting?
No, never. Gender should never have any place in any political decision. Obviously, there's emotional parameters in any decision people make, but when it comes to a more clinical, objective approach to things, gender should never really come into it. Gender seems to be based on more opinion and experience, whereas the bigger picture regarding political issues should be what the facts and evidence dictate, whether that's a female-based researcher or a male-based researcher or whatever the evidence might have came from. It shouldn't really come down to gender. It should really come down to what is logical and evidence-based.
Which seems to be the opinion of a majority of people. John, thank you for your call. Tricia, I suppose in a sense, if we're saying that people don't gravitate towards jobs that were seen traditionally as being male-dominated, that a lot of that the responsibility lies with education in many ways. For you, was politics a natural choice, if you like, or did you anticipate that it would be, that you might encounter some resistance as a woman?
I came from a very, very political background. My father was involved in the trade union movement in the Labour Party. So politics was discussed in our house since I was a child. My dad let me stay up and watch the general election in 1964, which probably lets out my age. But it was a very, very political household. I can't remember much about politics at school, but certainly politics was something I was always interested in. So I think it probably does come from education, but, there is a cultural background, and that comes from the family as well. And I think, a lot depends on the kind of background that children grow up in and what are the pinch points, where is it that they learn about and get excited about politics and want to be part of politics in the way that you can change things.
Thank you very much indeed, Tricia Marwick.
0500 92 95 00. Morning Call on BBC Radio Scotland.
And just before we finish today's show, I want to go back to our discussion earlier this morning, which centred on the Archbishop of Canterbury, former Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, declaring a U-turn. That was on the question of assisted dying, which has resulted in the Church of England calling for an inquiry into the bill on assisted dying, describing it as mistaken and dangerous. And I was asking you if you had changed your views on assisted dying, if you were for it indeed, or if you were against it, what your views were, and if that was influenced by anyone in particular. We've got George, who's in Edinburgh, calling in about the bill. Thanks for calling us, George.
Good morning, Cathy.
Tell me your views.
First of all, I probably should say I'm not George Carey, by the way, just in case anyone gets the idea that I've removed myself from England and moved to Scotland. I want to say, basically, we're asking the wrong question. We're asking, do we want to legislate for assisted suicide? and really what the question should be is, do you want to legislate for people having the best quality of life that they can have? Now, I mean by that quite simply that people are scared and worried about the possibility of what might happen at the end of their life. And Margaret Macdonald certainly made it clear that she didn't want to be a burden. Our society, though, is what positions that thought, and it's not the way it has to be. Passing assisted suicide legislation only reconfirms that what we are saying to ourselves is that once you get past a certain age or a certain level of ability, you become a burden. And what I'm simply saying is that we need to turn that round and say that what we should be saying is that no matter what age you are or what your level of ability is, that you have a right to a full life, a life without pain, but certainly a life without feeling that you should not be here anymore.
And do you believe that palliative care is something that we should be talking about more and considering a lot more?
Not just palliative care. As a disabled person, I'm extremely worried by things like the withdrawal of the Independent Living Fund, although it will be introduced in Scotland. It's being taken away from disabled people in the rest of United Kingdom. And what that says is that the very money that people need to live independently, to live a life that is as interesting and full as it can be made by money, is being withdrawn, in which case many people will have no quality of life and will therefore feel that they are a burden. And along with the palliative care issue, they will become anxious and scared and feel that not only do they want to kill themselves, but they are being ushered into that decision by the surrounding circumstances.
Thank you, George, for calling in. That was George. We're talking about the issue of